All right, so good morning, guys. We're going to continue along with the Bot101 introduction lecture. Last week we covered the history, and this week we're going to do expand on that. We'll do classification of herbs and kind of discuss some pharmacology uh, related to herbs and how herbs are used as sources for certain drugs, and also kind of how, in general, herbal constituents interact with our bodies. If you find that the sound gets choppy, it could be something on my end or it could be something on your end. So if you're noticing that the screen is freezing, the sound is getting choppy, and the quality of the video goes down, I can turn off my video and just use the sound only, only my microphone, and that can improve it. Occasionally, though, it could just be your own internet connection, and it could just be a temporary thing. But if I get enough people sort of complaining about the quality, I'll just flip it back over to microphone only. Okay, because you don't really need to see my face, but it might help just on some level. Okay. So quickly, we're going to talk about how herbs are classified. Now, one thing someone asked me before is botanical medicine the same as herbal medicine? Uh, and I would say yes, it is. I don't really know why naturopaths refer to it as botanical medicine, because I would say the layperson doesn't know what that is, and they know what herbal medicine is. So you could use either term. If you have any questions, please ask them. There's a little area where you can type in a question. I can type in a personal response or one to the entire class if necessary, okay? So when it comes to herbs, there's a few different ways that you can classify it. You can classify it based on taxonomy. And so this is like the scientific binomial, what family, order, genus, and species the plant belongs to. Most of the time, this is very useful to ensure that you're getting the exact herb that you're wanting. Because the problem with using the common name is there could be multiple herbs that go by the same name. You know, for example, there's a herb in the Amazon called dragon's blood. There's one in China called dragon's blood. They're two different genus and species. They're completely unrelated plants, and the medicinal properties associated with it is totally unrelated. The only thing that they have in common is they both are kind of look like our red resinous sort of substance. So, knowing that you're getting the right plant for your patient, or if you're a manufacturing, ensuring that the product that you're getting is correct, you got to make sure that you know what the genus and species is. Okay. Now, other ways that you can categorize plants and herbs is by their actions or medicinal actions. And so um, this is a useful one because you may want to say, oh, these herbs are all, let's say, alterative herbs, adaptogens, astringents, antimicrobials. And in general, the action is most useful to the clinicians because this ensures that if someone has high blood pressure, you want to get an antihypertensive herb, for example. Now, herbs will have multiple actions associated with it, but you could divide them into this category as well, and have a list of herbs that are astringents, anti-inflammatory, etc. Um, Another way that we can organize herbs is based on the system they belong to. So this is a little bit less specific than the action. So it could be the cardiovascular system. Maybe a group of herbs go into that. And often books are divided in chapters based on the system. And then within the system, it can be further divided based on action. So cardiovascular herbs could be antihypertensives. They could be cardiotonics. They could be hypolipidemics, meaning the lower cholesterol. It could be blood thinners or antiplatelet herbs. Okay, so that would be action would be more specific, and body system would be more sort of general. Another way that you can look at herbs is based on the phytochemical constituents. We're going to talk about this in more detail. And so when you're looking at the constituents, what the constituents are is basically the chemicals that make up the plant. And these chemicals are responsible for the medicinal actions that are associated with that herb. So when it comes to constituents, there are often similarity between certain types of phytochemicals and the medicinal properties they have. So if you understood that uh, a herb had, let's say, an isoquinoline alkaloid in it, you could probably deduce what actions would be associated with it, because we know herbs like golden seal or barberry, um, or a Chinese herb called coptis, all contain isoquinoline alkaloids, and they also are all antimicrobials, antifungals, antibacterial herbs. And so based on the phytochemical class, sometimes you can deduce what the actions were. So if you gave me a list of herbs and what the phytochemicals were in it and said these are the predominant phytochemicals, I could look at it and, I might be able to guess and get 80% or 90% of the time, what actions are associated with that particular herb. Some constituent classes are very very precise in their action, while other things like a phenolic compound, for example, could have multiple actions. It could be anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, antioxidant. It could also have antihypertensive properties. So there could be multiple actions associated with a single constituent, and also a single herb could also have multiple constituents in it. Constituents and phytochemicals, the same term, and it's used interchangeably, okay? And so based on the constituents, phytochemicals or constituents, they could be classified based on how they're made, their structures. Sometimes they're based on their also how they behave, like if they're astringent or not. So just another way to look at it. And finally, sometimes books are organized based on geography or herbal tradition. So, for example, these herbs may be used in South American herbs or Asian herbs or African herbs. Um, and this is probably the least useful for a clinician, because um, there's so much trade going on, and so much incorporation of various herbs from various herbal traditions that it's not as important, I would say, now. But in the past, there'd be a lot of, when we look at Western herbalism now, we've we have our North American herbs that are indigenous to North America. We have herbs that are indigenous to Europe. Some of those herbs were probably originally from Asia that migrated or have always existed in both Europe and Middle East and Asia. Some of them were introduced to North America from Europe or Asia and have spread and have sort of are now a natural herb or a weed that grows here. So anyways, that just gives you an idea of how different things can be classified. For the purpose of you learning stuff, you need to know the genus and species of herbs. The family is useful because often, going back to the top, often herbs that have the same are in the same family will often produce the same phytochemical classes, or often there could be overlapping things. When you're looking at the classification of things in general, biological system, uh, Carolus Linnaeus was the guy who was basically the father of modern taxonomy, who created this system. And this is what botanists use and zoologists use. Everybody uses this to classify and try to organize things, because that's what we want to do, is be able to put things in little boxes and have a better understanding. With herbal medicine, the only thing we really want to focus on is the genus and species, and also the family is not a bad thing to know about as well. I won't really be discussing a lot about the family, but certainly when you understand what family the herbs belong to, you start seeing patterns. For example, if you have like the mint family, has lots of herbs like peppermint, mint, lemon balm, oregano, thyme. All these herbs in that family you'll find in your kitchen or in your herbal tea drawer. And the one thing that's common to all of them, in addition to kind of how the plants look and the way the leaves are coming out and the way the flowers look, but from a medicinal standpoint, they all basically contain essential oils. They're very, very rich in essential oils. And so they share some overlapping actions that are associated with the essential oils. So essential oils in general, for example, have a positive effect on digestive function. And so most of these herbs are used as digestive aids on some level, okay? So knowing that they belong to the mint family, you would automatically kind of go, I'm pretty confident they're in the mint family. There's going to be a digestive component to them. And then you're like, they're probably going to have essential oils. That means aids digestion, okay? When it comes to writing out family, genus, and species, like I said, we don't really worry about, kingdom, obviously, if you're talking about plants, you're in that kingdom. The only difference there would be medicinal mushrooms are going to be on the fungi kingdom, right? We usually skip past the division, class, and order and get down to the family and the genus and species. Now, one thing, when the genus and species is written out, usually it's written like Echinacea and Angustifolia. It tends to be written in italics with a capital on the genus and the lowercase on the species, okay? Not all books do that. It's not always that way, but that's how it's supposed to be. And then these plants will also have a common name associated with it. So you could have multiple plants with the same common name, uh, like the dragon's blood I mentioned, were same common name but different genus and species. But also certain plants like purple coneflower, which is Echinacea angustifolia, it may also have multiple common names associated with it. So people could call it by different things. So purple coneflower, that's one term. A lot of people just call it Echinacea, so they use the genus name as the common name as well. And there's other terms for it. I think some of them will call it like indigenous First Nations people have different names for it. Some people refer to it as like snake bite bane or something like that as well, though it's not very common, okay? So for the purposes of the exam, you need to know the common name. And for the second half of the course, I'm going to provide you with, most questions will have just a common name, and then I'll give you, for the final exam, 5 questions that'll say, link up the common name with the genus and species for the herbs that we've discussed in the gastrointestinal tract. And so there's maybe about 30 of these you got to learn. And you do need to know these for NPLEX as well later on in subsequent years. But there's a lot of things that we discussed last week that I'm not going to ask you to memorize the genus and species for every single one of those things, just because you have enough to learn, okay? Any questions on that before we move on to drugs, herbs, and pharmacology? You guys following me? You guys alive out there? Just give me a little bit of something so I know you're out there. Alive and ready. Okay. Doing great. Hello. Perfect. Okay. So drugs, herbs, and pharmacology. So appreciate, when it comes to herbal medicine, herbs are drugs. The term drug was derived from, I don't know what language it was. I think it was maybe German, the term druga. So druga means plants. So plants are the sources of most of the drugs in medicine. I would say 30 years ago and further back were probably derived directly from plants. We've become a little bit more high tech in how we're developing drugs now, but historically, herbs came from drugs. The main drugs came from herbs. There are some differences between drugs and herbs now that it's important to emphasize. Okay, when it comes to drugs, when you buy a drug, generally speaking, it contains probably only one substance in it, or one active substance. I mean, it could have binders and fillers and stuff like that. But when you buy, let's say, aspirin, you're buying acetylsalicylic acid and some binders, and they pack it into a pill. If you were to take something like willow bark, it will contain salicylic acid, slightly different than what's in aspirin, and it also has other phytochemicals in there as well, some other phenolic compounds, some tannins, some and some other little bit in the herb itself will have probably some starch and some other things in it as well. um, so there could be not just one active ingredient, but there could be potentially three, four, five, or six different things. There could be hundreds of different phytochemicals working synergistically with flavonoids in there and anthocyanidins and alkaloids and all these different things. So herbs generally have multiple phytochemicals working synergistically kind of helping to work together. And it's very different than a drug that has one thing. Now, there are some drugs on the market where, for example, some of the cold and flu medications could have an antihistamine, a little ephedrine in it, could have some kind of expectorant drug. So sometimes they will combine two or three different things to make a cocktail, but it still is limited to probably less than three substances. Okay. And like I said, with herbs, you could be getting a whole bunch of different phytochemicals, even some vitamins and minerals potentially, different classes of phytochemicals that work synergistically or work in combination together. And so when you look at a herb and you're like, okay, what's the active ingredient in this? Like, for example, if you look at the health benefits of eating an orange and you kind of go, okay, oranges are good for you. So let's see if we can figure out what's really healthy about an orange and extract that one compound. We'll just take only that. Um, if you did that, you might focus on the vitamin C in it and say, yeah, we'll just extract the vitamin C and throw the rest of it away and see what happens. Or if you focus on the bioflavonoids that are in it, or if you focus on the pectin, the type of fiber that's in it, or if you focused on the carbohydrates in it. There's a whole bunch of different things that have medicinal properties when you're eating a fruit or a vegetable, or you consume a herbal tea, or you take a herbal product. And as you refine it and process that original product, the herb, it changes in the chemicals that you have in your formula, and it also changes potentially the medicinal actions associated with it. So, for example, oranges might help prevent scurvy. But if you um, did some kind of extraction on an orange and eventually extracted out only the pectin and gave it to people with scurvy, you wouldn't help those people, right? Because you've removed and focused inadvertently on the wrong phytochemical, thinking that pectin is good for you, which it is, but it's not good for scurvy, right? And scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency. Or you focus on the flavonoids, which indirectly can help with scurvy, but they're not the only thing, okay? So understanding that drugs and herbs are very different, and when you take a single phytochemical out of a herb and you give it to someone in really high dosage without the presence of other phytochemicals, you've no longer given them a herb, you've given them a natural drug. For example, if I give someone quercetin as a bioflavonoid at 500 milligrams, 3 times a day, um, it's going to behave very differently than the onion or the cup of tea that also contains quercetin. So you can't compare a single compound to the whole herb extract. Same thing with your diet. You can't compare taking, a supplement that's rich in beta carotene and expect to get the same benefits of eating a diet that's rich in beta carotene, which is also going to have carotenoids and anthocyanins and vitamins and minerals and fiber and everything, different amino acid compositions, stuff like that. Okay. So that's one difference between drugs and herbs. Another difference is quality. Drugs are very pure and very precise for the most part. I would say sometimes manufacturing processes in other countries aren't to the same standard that we have in North America. And sometimes drugs can be contaminated with something, but generally speaking, usually the drugs are very, very precise. Now, can you guys hear the talking in reception right now? I don't think people know that I'm lecturing. It gets a little loud sometimes in there. Um, just curious. Yeah, you can. I'll have to remind my receptionist to kind of keep it down out there. Um, anyways, it won't be there for very long. So when it comes to quality, drugs are supposed to be pure, meaning they have like, let's say 99.9% of the active ingredient with minimal or no contaminants. They may have some binder and fillers in it as well, but generally speaking, the quality is very pure. Now, when it comes to herbs, uh, sometimes researchers and doctors might refer to them as being dirty drugs. And there's obviously a derogatory sort of way of talking about them by referring to them as dirty. And the reason why they're dirty is because they're not pure. And appreciate, there's disadvantages of not having something that's 99.9% pure, whatever you're trying to look for. When you look at herbs, herbs are a little bit like wine, where appreciate with wine, the quality of the wine can vary from year to year. So 2005 Rioja is better than 2006 Rioja, just because for some reason that red wine in Spain, the climate was different. There's different phytochemical expression. It's known to be a good year for it. Also, the same grapes grown in Ontario just don't produce the same quality of wine. If it's grown at a higher altitude, it has a slightly different effect on the phytochemicals that get produced than if it's grown at sea level. So the weather, the climate, when it's harvested, even like what time of the day it's harvested can impact the phytochemicals that are in it. So the problem is that from a research standpoint, this is frustrating because there is such variation from batch to batch that researchers don't like that. So they're trying to like standardize it and bring it down to a single thing. But appreciate when you do that, you are altering uh, the substance. So when you're looking at red wine, yeah, you know what, an Ontario wine may not taste as good as a wine from Spain if you start getting really picky. But they're both going to have a positive effect on cholesterol and blood pressure, and if you drink too much wine, it's going to be bad for you. So there's still health benefits, and yeah, you might get a slightly better results if you're drinking certain wines that are higher in resveratrol than other ones. But in general, I think that having a little bit of wine has been shown to be beneficial, regardless of where it comes from. And there may be a um, slightly more health benefits from certain regions than from other regions. Certainly, white wine doesn't do what you want compared to red wines, and that's a different manufacturing process. Okay, so when you have white wine, you've removed the anthocyanins, and there's not as much resveratrol in that. So appreciate same genus and species prepared slightly differently, you get a different substance altogether. Okay. Uh, so someone's asking, so wine doesn't expire. That's not true. Wine does expire. Um, wine gets better with age to a certain point, and then it can go mufa or moldy. Somehow, the integrity of the, uh, the cork can be compromised, and sometimes it just starts to change. So when you have like a 50-year-old bottle of wine, it might be worth $30,000, and then you open it up, it turns out it's gone bad, and then you've wasted all that money on it. Generally speaking, I think there's, for the first, let's say, 10, 15 years, you definitely can guarantee the wine's going to get better. But then after that, it starts becoming a little bit riskier. The other thing that happens with wine over time is that uh, certain phytochemicals will start to polymerize and precipitate out of solution. So when you look at some of the older bottles of wine will have a sediment in it, and that sediment is some of the phytochemicals that have health benefits. So I don't know if it doesn't always go bad, but it does change the taste and the phytochemicals. So I don't know whether or not a 15 bottle of wine is as good for you as a 1 year bottle of wine. Like I don't know if anyone's ever looked at the bioavailability of the phytochemicals or not. So wine does expire. It can have a very long shelf life for sure, but certainly I've drank wines that you would hope were going to be really good bottles of wine, but they've just turned on you. Okay. The other thing is herbs do have an expiry date. We'll talk about that more in the second half of the term. The big thing with herbs is it depends on how you store it. Appreciate if you have, let's say, powdered culinary spices like powdered cumin or coriander in your kitchen, and it's been there for 5 or 6 years. Those essential oils that are desired in those spices slowly start to evaporate over time, and no longer has the desired effect. If you had it as a whole seed, it'll last longer, or a whole herb root or whatever it is, leaf, it may last longer. Um, Also, if you look at something like marijuana, if the active ingredients in marijuana are somewhat volatile, and so if you had marijuana that was 5 years old sitting in your cabinet, and then you went and tried to use it, you wouldn't have the same effects as if you were to have the same batch consumed immediately. I'm just giving you real life examples. Now that marijuana is legal, we can talk about that. So if you buy certain things, it does lose its potency over time. And it may be that it just evaporates away and it disappears, or it could become oxidized, or it could react with moisture, or it could become moldy. So lots of things that you have to keep into consideration. Tinctures in general, which are alcohol extracts of herbs, tend to have a very long shelf life. And for the most part, we know that there's tinctures that are 100 years old that still have the active ingredient in it. You know, they haven't become toxic, but they may not be as potent as if they're a little newer. So I don't, nobody knows exactly how long, what the expiry date is. So some of these things are just pretty arbitrary when they put them on. Okay. So I hope that answers your question, Laura. Um, Another thing with herbs versus drugs is that drugs, generally speaking, are more potent. Okay. And they're more powerful, they're stronger. And so naturally, doctors or researchers like drugs more because when something's more powerful and has a more profound effect on the body, you tend to see, if you're doing a research study, it's easier to research the study, the benefits. So if you have a powerful anti-hypertensive drug, so a very powerful drug that lowers blood pressure, then what that means is if it can drop blood pressure by like 30 points or by 40 points in someone by taking 10 milligrams of that drug, you'll see a profound reduction in blood pressure in a group of people. And so what that means from a research standpoint is you might only need 10 people in your research group in order to see statistical significance, right? Because when you're doing research, you're trying to tease the difference between a placebo group and the actual drug group. And if the effects of the drug or the substance that you're looking at is not as powerful, it's a little bit more subtle, then it starts to overlap with the placebo effect. And so it might still work, but if you had, let's say, 50 people in your study, you may not get the 95% confidence that you want that it's superior to placebo, right? So in that case, you might have to use a group of people with like 1,000 people instead of 100 people. But a really, really powerful drug, you might only need 10 people to show you, like, yeah, when you inject someone with ephedrine, you see a profound effect that it increases the heart rate in every single person over the control group, right? Compared to placebo, okay? So drugs are more powerful, more potent often, not always, but often compared to herbs. And like I used the analogy, I think I used it last week, when you're trying to select a tool to do the job, people often think the best tool is the most powerful tool. And so if you're an archaeologist and you want to uncover some ancient ruins, you go in there with a bulldozer, it's way more powerful than a person with a broom or with a shovel and a brush. But appreciate, you can still get the job done with people. It just may take 10 or 20 more people, and it might take a little longer to get the job done. But the advantage is when something's not as powerful, is they're less likely to damage the structure. So with powerful substances, it's easier to research them. You see a very pronounced effect right away. but there's also more side effects. And you keep seeing, like, when a drug gets released and comes on the market, the longer it's been on the market for, the more side effects and the more bad news comes out. When aspirin came out 20 some years ago, basically said, oh, take aspirin, lowers your risk of having a heart attack. People all started taking aspirin every single day. And now the rules are, ooh, don't give aspirin to anybody unless they have diabetes, because the risks associated with taking it long term exceeds the benefits. Okay. So the other thing with herbs is, as a naturopath, I don't give people just one thing. I usually will say, okay, I want you to eat this for breakfast, reduce this, consume more of that. Here's a supplement for this. Go to the gym and exercise. So I may give them 5 or 6 recommendations over a couple months in order to normalize cholesterol or blood pressure or anxiety or whatever it may be. I'm not just giving one single pill and expecting that that will resolve the problem, because usually people's health concerns arise from not eating properly, not exercising, not getting enough sleep, stress in their lives, interpersonal conflict, and you need to tackle all these things in order to potentially cure the person. And sometimes I'm not the only person who should be seeing that patient. Someone has a lot of depression or anxiety. Maybe they should be getting help from someone who does cognitive-based therapy. And I just want to also, as an aside, say that as a naturopath, we learn how to do a lot of stuff. My advice is, don't try to be good at everything, because it's impossible. Figure out what you're good at, focus on that, and if it's something that you don't think you're that good at, refer people to someone else. You never will lose patients, or you might lose patients, but you're not going to lose them because they're upset with you. You might lose them because if they have neck pain and you don't do acupuncture or manip very often, you want to refer them to someone else, go for it. And then just, you'll end up attracting the people that really find you beneficial, and I think that's fine to always refer people. And working as a team, like if I have someone who comes in, I might refer them to massage or to see the osteopath or to see their medical doctor and say, yeah, this would also benefit you and stuff. It's okay working as a team. We shouldn't be working in isolation anyways. It's just not as good. Okay. So drugs are more potent than herbs, generally speaking. That being said, there are some herbs that are extremely potent and extremely powerful. Herbs like aconite, one small amount could potentially kill you. So I am making generalizations. When you compare metformin to aconite, metformin is less potent and has less side effects. So, but in general, most of the herbs that I use are less potent, and I would say safer, almost always safer than the herbs. Okay. One of the big issues with healthcare now is that our current medical model that medical doctors follow is based on an evidence-based model, and that's good. You would think it means we don't want to give things to people unless there's evidence to show that it's safe and effective. And so things have to go through a lot of rigor in order to be approved and recommended. And that's good when you're talking about drugs. And so drug companies are motivated to conduct research because ultimately they're going to make money off of the drugs that they sell. And when you develop a drug and you have a drug that's unique that your company has made, you can patent that. And there's a window of time where you have exclusive rights to selling that before the generic companies are allowed to sell the exact same drug for less money. So you kind of have a monopoly over that drug for a period of time. And, as evil as that sounds, appreciate the fact that a drug company needs to get paid for the research they conduct and need to get a return for their investment. It's basic business stuff. If you're going to spend $1 million developing or $10 million developing a drug, you need to make more than 10 million back to cover your costs and pay out everyone who's been involved in the project. And otherwise, nobody would do research, because it's just like, why would it? I mean, I'd love to do research on herbs, but I can't just do it all on a volunteer basis and pay for everything out of pocket. It's just not feasible, right? So drugs need to be researched and patented to make money off of it. So that's one advantage of drugs. You can't patent chamomile tea. You can't patent an orange. If you could, that would mean that if I patented an orange, basically I would say everybody who eats an orange has to give me like 1 cent. Um, it would just be ethically wrong. So you can't really patent a herbal formula or herb by itself. You could potentially patent a proprietary blend of, like, maybe you add ginseng and licorice together and you call it, Dr. Gallon's awesome herbs. I could potentially patent that, and then anyone who wants to use that precise combination of 10 milligrams of ginseng with 2 milligrams of licorice, uh, they can't do that combination unless they pay me money. You could do stuff like that, or you could do some kind of special extraction process that's kind of unique. If you were able to establish that what you're doing is different than what anyone else has ever done and it's very novel, you could potentially patent that. But in general, you can't patent herbs. There's ways you could do it if you wanted to, and then that way you could say, my herbal product is unique and I've conducted research, and if you want to use my formula, you have to pay me money. Um, but beyond that, you can't just patent a single herb, okay? And business makes the world go round. So you can easily say, oh, drug companies are evil. I don't think the people that work, I've worked there, the people that work there, they're not evil people. Maybe the people running it are evil. But the innate fact that when it comes to business, if your priority is not focusing on, um, as a company, you're focusing on maximizing profits, it drives a very different business model than if your goal is to help people, right? And drug companies will go out of business if they don't make money and make a profit. So it gets complicated. The disadvantage with the fact that you can patent drugs versus herbs is the fact that more research is being done on drugs. Therefore, there's more evidence to support the drugs than there is for herbs. So naturally, medical doctors don't think that herbs work because there's not a lot of quote unquote evidence, because there's not enough clinical trials. But if these things have been around, like I mentioned last time, for 40,000 years, they've been used by very, millions of people, and even humanoids. The Neanderthals were using it. I think there's something to be said that there is some evidence to support these things, just different type of evidence than double-blind clinical trial. Now, one thing about drugs and herbs that's, I think, unique, because herbs have multiple constituents or phytochemicals in it, the likelihood of it having more medicinal actions and properties associated with it is much greater with a herb than a drug. Now, that's not to say that certain drugs don't affect multiple systems in the body. Like, for example, some blood pressure medications could be a diuretic, so you could use it for swelling in the ankles along with lowering blood pressure. But usually it's limited in the number of actions they have. So the herbs tend to have more action. So a herb could be used for cholesterol, it could be used for blood pressure, it could be used for menstrual cramps, could be used for sleep. Like, it seems like there's an endless list of actions that are associated with it that you can use this for, conditions associated with it. And you do see more of that. Now, sometimes when you're learning herbs, you might only learn like St. John's wort is a herb. It's used for depression. It's got great research. So when you hear St. John's wort, you might automatically think depression. But it also has other effects as well. It can be used as an antiviral. It can be used to help with wound healing, for example. So those are kind of unrelated actions that are related to a few different constituents in it, okay? Another thing with herbs and drugs is that there will be an overlapping in the type of actions that both possess. So there are herbs that are diuretics. There are drugs that are diuretics. There are herbs that are anti-inflammatory. There are drugs that are anti-inflammatory. But there are some unique actions associated with herbs that you don't see in the drug world. For example, something like an adaptogen is a herb that helps the body cope with stress. I love these. I consume them all the time. I'm jacked up on them right now because I didn't get a very good sleep last night because I had both children were waking me up. So adaptogens are amazing. There's no drug that does that same sort of thing. I'm going to turn off my webcam here. Another example are alternative herbs. There's no drug that acts as an alternative, and this is dates back to Greco-Roman times, where they used alternative herbs to clean the blood for various conditions, for skin conditions or overall other conditions where it was believed that people were dyscratic or they had dirty blood that was contributing to the problem. Digestive bitters, although a lot of drugs taste bitter, they don't necessarily have a bitter action, and so bitters are used to promote digestion. Phytoestrogens. People get all freaked out when they hear about phytoestrogens, and I'll talk about this more. These are things that modulate estrogen receptors. And I guess drugs could do this as well, but generally speaking, most drugs that affect estrogen either turn the receptors on or they block the receptor. Okay, so sometimes there's no equivalent in the pharmaceutical realm for these things. Gurmeet asking a question. He says, I've been told that you can patent a formula or recipe of a herbal supplement, but you have list each herb and amount. But if you use proprietary blend, you don't need to list the amount. Or is that correct? Possibly. I don't know enough about the details on that. Proprietary blend means it's a secret little blend. And I think you can patent proprietary blends, or at least you can call it a proprietary blend. You don't have to reveal what's in it. The only problem with that is I'm always suspicious of proprietary blends because I'm like, I don't know what's in it. And so there could be something that a patient could be allergic to. If you're not telling me what's in it, I can't really recommend it. So I don't know for certain the answer to that. Now, when it comes to research in herbal medicine, you can see here that the research that's being conducted is exponential. Okay, so we know herbal medicine's been used for tens of thousands of years, but really, the research that we're talking about, the majority of it has been conducted probably in the last 20 years, I would say, even 10 years, probably, like, because it's exponential now. Because there's, if you look at the population on the planet and everything else, more people are researching it. There's more interest in herbal medicine. So it's going through the roof now. And appreciate, greater than 50 years ago, there wasn't that much published research. And even like the scientific, the way that research studies were conducted has changed. What we have is the double-blind clinical trial. That's not been around that long. 100 years ago, people didn't do that, right? So I don't know when it all started. So research in herbal medicine really has just occurred in the last 20 years, I would say. Even since I've graduated, I've seen just a big surge in research. And when you compare this to research in drugs, there's a lot more research into drugs, but drug companies aren't also creating a lot of new drugs. They're kind of just tweaking the existing ones, which is a little bit problematic. So anyways, I would say when I look at all the herbs that I use, some herbs like St. John's wort have amazing research to support their use. And if you were to try to select either a drug, antidepressant drug, or for example, St. John's wort, and you're trying to decide which one to use for your patient, I would say if you followed an evidence-based model and evaluated the actual clinical trials, the conclusion I would make is, and I think most researchers should make, is that St. John's wort should be the first-line drug against depression, okay? Because it works as well as traditional antidepressant drugs, and it has a better side effect profile. So as effective and safe means I would use it for mild to moderate depression, and some studies even say severe depression. Now, for me, I don't generally jump to using St. John's wort off the bat. I might start with doing nutrients like vitamin B6, maybe 5-HTP, recommend some cognitive-based therapy, a little mindfulness meditation, some exercise, imbalanced blood sugar, lots of other things you can do before giving St. John's wort. And appreciate, if you're giving St. John's wort, even though it's safe and effective, you're still not necessarily addressing the underlying cause of the problem. If someone's problem is they're iron deficient, or they don't exercise, or they're oversleeping, or they're having problems coping with a breakup, giving a pill isn't addressing the root cause, whether that pill is a drug or a herb. Okay, so a lot of the herbs that we use in practice has some research to support it. It may have been used for thousands of years, but there may only be like some in vitro studies, meaning in a test tube, or in vivo in an animal. Maybe there's only like a few small trials showing that it's beneficial with humans, but most of them don't reach the caliber uh, of evidence that you would get with a drug. Okay. And there's frankly some herbs that I use daily that have zero clinical trials to support it. And I'm okay with that. Any questions before we move on here? So I'll finish this section, then we'll have to take a little break. Okay, so give me about 10 or 15 minutes. So drugs from plants. Here's a beautiful photograph. I didn't take it. This is done in National Geographic. This is a man in Tanzania harvesting a herb called Artemisia annua, which is not native to Africa. It's native to China. And this is one of the most important drugs that's been developed in the last couple decades, I would say. And what's neat about the story about this drug is it illustrates really well the kind of how drugs get approved and how difficult it is for herbs to get credibility. Okay, so artemisinin is an anti-malarial drug that originally came from a herb called Chinese wormwood, or Artemisia annua. And when you look at the historical use of this, texts that go back almost 2,000 years refer to this herb for certain type of medical conditions. They may not have known precisely what caused malaria, but they knew that malaria was associated with these fevers that would sort of periodic fevers where you'd have a high fever and then sweats, and you go in and out of that. And they recognized, and they had a Chinese diagnosis for it, and they would use this herb for it. So around 200 BC, it dates back a long, long time. Now, in the 1960s, they did the first test tube trial showing that there was antimalarial activity associated with a crude extract from this plant. And then in the 1980s, they did the very first clinical trial in the Western world, okay? That was published in a well-respected journal. I believe it was The Lancet. And so 1984, they showed it worked against malaria. And then based on the next 20 years, there was hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials conducted, systematic reviews, and then finally in 2004, the artemisinin based combinational therapy, so they use artemisinin along with a couple other antimalarial drugs, became the first or second line treatment against chloroquine resistant malaria. Okay, so the World Health Organization finally, after the first clinical trial, so we're talking 20 years later, basically said, yeah, we should be using this drug. Okay, and that's great, but appreciate it should have been adopted probably about 10 years earlier. There was a sufficient enough evidence and enough clinical trials and reviews had been conducted that the policymakers should have recommended it. But there's a huge delay, a good at least 10-year delay of when the evidence supported it and it was actually adapted, assuming that you want to look at, you need to have clinical trials and all that kind of evidence. But we knew about it, that it was working in these Chinese books for 2,000 years. And so what that translates to in human lives is that there was a window, even when there was enough research to support it, people were dying from malaria that didn't need to. So potentially thousands, if not, I don't know how many, maybe tens of thousands of people died from malaria who didn't need to. And over the 2,000 years, if it could have been, if people would have accepted and spread around the world, maybe millions of people could have been prevented from dying of using it. So this is an example of, here's a herb that we knew about for 2,000 years and how long it took for mainstream medicine to, basically accept that, yeah, it's effective. And they didn't do the whole herb. They're using basically um, uh, an extract or like a synthetic version of one of the compounds in it. And I don't know what the status is right now, whether or not the herb works as effectively or not as the actual drug. But it's interesting when you start looking at some of the research studies, they'll actually design trials comparing the two, and they'll actually show that the drug is superior to the herb. But what they'll do is they'll actually take the herb and boil it for a long period of time, and then basically rendering it ineffective. Because one of the things with artemisinin, which is interesting, is if you look at the little bottom left hand corner of this little picture, you've got two O's stuck together. That's basically a peroxide bridge. And peroxides are unstable compounds, and that's essential for its mechanism of action. And if you boil it for too long, the heat will break apart that bond, rendering this compound ineffective. And so traditionally, the Chinese herbalists would not make it as a decoction, meaning they wouldn't brew it in hot water for too long. They would actually boil the water, let it cool, and then add the hot but not boiling hot water to it to do the extraction. So they were aware that there was that it was heat sensitive, which is kind of neat. Laura's asking, why did reviewers didn't catch it? I don't know. It just takes time for people to do things, right? There's always a delay. I think with technology, it's going to be faster. People communicate faster. But in the old days, these things would get published, and then it would be in books, and you wouldn't necessarily have online access to it because the internet didn't exist in the early '90s, or wasn't really widely used. So things are changing. So again, here's the artemisinin molecule, that peroxide bridge I talked about there. How it works is it interacts with free heme. Heme is the iron that's used to build your red blood cells. And the parasite, when it infects the red blood cell, liberates free heme. And then because this free heme is toxic, it'll very quickly polymerize, use something called heme polymerase to neutralize these heme to make polymers that are safe. So what happens is free heme itself is toxic. And when you add the artemisinin, it that iron will basically break apart this peroxide group, making this artemisinin molecule a free radical that can then bind to proteins in DNA and other things and have a localized toxic effect within that infected red blood cell and kill the parasite. So that's how it works, which is kind of neat. Not really essential that you need to know that, but it's kind of neat. And so you can see how much the research is starting to plateau and go down now, because I think there's enough evidence here that people are like, yeah, we don't need to waste any money researching this, but kind of neat. Now, some other plants that are sources for drugs, we'll go through a few of these. Quinine, which is not as an important drug anymore, but certainly there was a period of time where this was probably one of the first drug extracts used to treat malaria. And it was discovered in Peru by a Jesuit priest who noticed that the indigenous people, when they got malaria, would drink this herbal extract and it would make them better. And so this information was brought back to Europe, and in the 17th century, extracts were used in Italy to treat malaria, because Europe, southern, like especially in Italy, there was malaria in various parts of Europe. So they had crude extracts in, and then in 1820 they actually extracted quinine, which is the main antimalarial compound in cinchona bark. And this was the first line drug against malaria until about the 1940s. And one thing that's interesting to mention about quinine is if you've ever had a gin and tonic, you've had very small amounts of an antimalarial drug called quinine in it. Now, it's so bitter that the amount that's in tonic water that you have with your gin is not going to have a therapeutic effect or even a toxic effect. It's very, very bitter in minuscule amounts, so it won't have a major effect on you in any sort of way, apart from promoting digestion. So if you get malaria, don't drink tonic water. You're probably going to get diabetes from the fructose in the tonic water before you get the enough of the quinine. But quinine was a very important antimalarial. And the reason why tonic water was developed was because the military, I think part of the British rations was they got quinine when they're in northern Africa. And it was so bitter that the way that the soldiers would basically make it palatable is add a whole bunch of sugar and bubbly water to it, and that's sort of how the tonic water came out. And then it was modified, and the dose went down, and they used less uh, quinine in it. But that's sort of the history of it. Okay. So it still remains as one of the World Health Organization lists of essential drugs. Now, I'd be curious if chinchonum bark, the whole plant extract, is superior or inferior to taking quinine, because often plants will have other compounds in it that may act synergistically. One of the problems with quinine is that most malarial bugs are resistant to quinine or quinine-based antimalarials. So there's methyloquin, like things like alarium. They're structurally very similar to quinine, even though they're a drug, not a naturally occurring substance. But I suspect that they probably, I would, I would gamble that the herb might be more effective than the single extract. Because what I've seen with other herbs is when you take a single compound out of the herb in isolation and give it to people, drug resistance occurs over time. But the whole herb tends to have less drug resistance. It doesn't mean that bugs can't become resistant, but it's much more difficult. We'll talk about that later. So when we talked about the artemisinin, remember how the artemisinin, which is a peroxide, reacts with the iron group to generate some kind of reactive oxygen species. The way that polymerase or the quinine works is it targets the heme polymerase, the enzyme that basically makes this toxic-free heme safe and forms these polymers. So quinine blocks that reaction. And so by combining a quinine-like antimalarial along with artemisinin, you would have a synergistic effect because they're targeting multiple enzymes or multiple sites in this pathway here. Okay. So another herb that you guys have probably heard of is digoxin. Now, digoxin originally came from foxglove, and this is historically used for heart failure. So the old medical texts refer to it as dropsy. Dropsy is basically you have ankle swelling, and it's a result of the heart not pumping effectively anymore, and basically blood pooling in the ankles. Okay, and you see that with people who get really severe edema, and so. For a long time, doctors had, conventional doctors, mainstream doctors didn't really have anything to give to people for this. So in the 1700s, there was a doctor called William Withering who had a patient came in with congestive heart failure with dropsy, and he said, "Sorry, I can't help you. I don't know what to do about that." And the patient went off, saw a local herbalist. The local herbalist gave him foxglove, and foxglove works as a heart tonic. And the way that it functions, there's the compound there. Oh, I hate when my slides aren't working properly. So digoxin, what it does is it acts as a positive ionotropic substance. And what that means is ions, meaning like the calcium and the sodium, things like that, it increases the force of contraction of the heart. Chronotropic refers to time. So a negative chronotropic substance slows down the heart rate. So what digoxin does is it increases the force of contractions and slows down the rate at which the heart pumps at. And as a result, it makes it work more efficiently. And so William Withering, when his patient came back and he was all better, he's like, "Well, what helped you?" So then he's like, "Oh, my herbalist gave me this plant." So then William Withering wrote a research paper or whatever, documented this, and then published it, and then got all the credit for it. And like most of the cases, herbalist's name is, unknown, and it will never go down in history. So Dr. Withering got all the credit for it. when in actual fact he wasn't the one who discovered it. Okay. So there's digoxin, ephedrine. So as I mentioned before, ephedra is a herb that contains ephedrine, and ephedrine is commonly found in cold and sinus medication. It's also its main mechanism of action is that it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so when you stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, it causes changes in blood flow in the body. So in your nostrils, it tends to cause vasoconstriction, and so it tends to dry things up in the sinuses because less blood's going in there and there's less edema then. It also makes the capillaries less leaky so that the less fluid goes into the interstitial space. And so primarily it's used in medicine as a decongestant, nasal decongestant. And because it has that stimulatory effect on the sympathetic nervous system, this is used for the non-drowsy version, okay? It can also be used to open up the bronchioles because the sympathetic nervous system controls dilation of the bronchioles. So it opens up the airways, reduces edema, but as a side effect, it also increases heart rate and blood pressure. So it's considered to be an essential medicine on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. And it's an alkaloid, just disappeared on me. And we'll talk about it later on. When it comes to aspirin, I'm sure everybody's heard of willow bark as being the source of aspirin. That's partially true. So many plants contain a compound called salicylic acid, okay? And even when you're eating fruits and vegetables, there are small amounts of salicylic acid in it, okay? White willow bark was traditionally used. Oh, why does it do that? Let's exit here for a second. White willow bark was used traditionally for fevers and inflammation, like how you might use aspirin. And in the 1800s, Charles Gerhard, he basically extracted salicylic acid and modified it in the lab to create acetylsalicylic acid. Now, it's very easy to add an acetyl group to various phenolic compounds. And so this is done, sometimes we'll add an acetyl group to like vitamin E to stabilize it or to other things. And so salicylic acid is what's naturally occurring. And in the lab, they add that acetyl group, which would probably allow you to patent, salicylic acid way back when, because you're able to modify it. And that acetyl group is reversible; it can be removed when it goes into solution. And certainly, I think one of the ways that it works is that basically the acetyl group is transferred onto the cyclooxygenase enzyme that's involved with inflammation and developing a number of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So aspirin or acetylsalicylic acid, Bayer is the company that basically sells it worldwide. So they sell aspirin, but you can buy the generic acetylsalicylic acid from lots of different companies. And it's considered to be one of the World Health Organization list of essential medicines. Some people take it acutely for pain and for inflammation. Diabetics are recommended to take it on a daily basis because in addition to decreasing inflammation, it decreases platelets and helps act as a blood thinner. This is both a good thing and a bad thing depending on the issue. So the take-home messages here is that salicylic acid is naturally occurring, and most of the drugs that we've talked about so far are naturally occurring, but aspirin or acetylsalicylic acid, to the best of my knowledge, is not naturally occurring in willow bark. So it's slightly been modified from what exists in the white willow bark that was traditionally used for inflammation and fevers. Okay. Oops. Oops. I hate when they do that. So another herb, another important drug is one called Tamiflu. And you may have heard about Tamiflu when there was the big threats of the flu pandemic. basically countries started to stockpile Tamiflu, and it's an important antiviral drug. It's not quite as good as we thought it was, but anyways, it still does help. Um, Tamiflu is not naturally occurring, but when this demand for the flu went up, what happened on the market is that a plant called star anise, uh, what it was worth per pound went up almost, I don't know if it was tenfold or whatever, but it went up uh, manyfold from what you could buy it for, because Tamiflu is not naturally occurring, but what they do is they use a compound in star anise called shikimic acid. And shikimic acid is basically is made by plants, certain plants, lots of different plants, including star anise. It just happens to be that star anise has really high amounts of it. It's used as a precursor to make certain amino acids in the body. Okay, and so drug companies, if they want to make Tamiflu, they're not going to start by beginning with a single carbon and then sticking another carbon on it and then sticking an oxygen on it and then eventually making Tamiflu, because it's an inefficient way to synthesize it. It would take a long time and it would be very expensive. The advantage of starting with shikimic acid is Tamiflu, there's, I don't know how many steps would be involved with it, but not that many steps to convert shikimic acid to Tamiflu. So if you start with a natural product, refine it, and then use that as your building block, and then purify it later on, um, it's a more it's more cost effective to do that. So again, I want to emphasize that star anise does not contain Tamiflu. That's like a good exam question, but herbs can be used as precursors to make drugs that don't normally exist in nature. Um, Now, Shikim, the other thing that's important to say is just because Tamiflu is made from star anise does not mean that star anise has similar or comparable antiviral properties. So it may have antiviral properties and it may not. I'm not really sure if it does or it doesn't, but you can't assume that you can use it interchangeably. So just because if someone has a flu, taking star anise may not do anything. Could be better, could be worse. I have no idea. Okay. I think I'm getting close to the end here. Um, Another important example is that there's a plant called the Pacific yew, which is a source of Taxol. And paclitaxel or Taxol is a really important anti-cancer drug used for breast cancer and ovarian cancer and a few other different types of cancers. And about 20 years ago, when I was in university, I took a natural products course, and this was a very interesting. Why does it keep doing that? I'm going to exit. This is an important drug, and the challenge that researchers were having and the medical profession was having is that they knew that Taxol was an effective anti-cancer drug and could help a lot of people. And the way that they discovered it was they were just screening just random plants for anti-cancer properties, and they found that the specific yew contained this compound called Taxol, and I have no idea why the plant was making it itself. And they found that it had really effective anti-cancer properties. Now, Pacific yew was never used traditionally for breast cancer or ovarian cancer, so they didn't research it based on a traditional knowledge of the plant and then try to figure out what the active ingredient is. They were just randomly screening it and found it had properties. And now they know that they've got this drug that potentially can work for cancer, but the big issue that they have is that it's very difficult to synthesize this in the lab. So if you look at Taxol, it contains a lot of chiral centers. And chiral centers means that when you try to make it, you get both a left-handed and right-handed version of it. So if you started off with, let's say, 1,000 pounds of starting material, every time you are trying to do a step to create another little addition to it that has a chiral center, you're going to lose potentially 50% of your or more of your drug, because you don't want the left-handed version, you may want the right-handed version, whatever it is. And so if you start off with 1,000 pounds, you may only end up getting about 200 milligrams of active ingredient if you have enough steps, because every step you lose stuff. So it was basically prohibitive to make this in a lab because of all these chiral centers. It was just too expensive. The other problem is that you couldn't just collect it from nature. You couldn't just basically go out, cut down the Pacific yew trees and do an extraction because the amount required to meet the demand exceeded what could be obtained from nature in a single year. So you basically would have to wipe out the entire population of Pacific yew to get enough of the active drug to supply the people that needed it for 1 year, and then you're out of luck. So the way that it was developed was they used plant cell fermentation technology. It's like a biotechnology where you got plant cells to express the enzymes required to make the Taxol. So it uses genetic engineering to do this, and that's one example where I don't have an issue of genetically modified organisms when they're kept in a lab and used to make certain drugs for people or whatever it may be. I think that's a good thing. I don't like it when it gets introduced into nature. That kind of scares me. But here's an example. The take home here is Taxol or paclitaxel exists in nature, was never used in traditional medicine, and it's obtained through using what's called plant cell fermentation. Okay. That's where I want to stop. Do you guys have any question? So Caitlin's asking, just confirming, do we or do we not need to know the mechanism of action for the herbs discussed? I don't think I go into a lot of detail on that. I might. I don't think if I did, it's not very many questions. I might say, which of the following uh, drugs has an antimalarial property by inhibiting heme polymerase? I could ask that, but there isn't going to be a lot of questions. So if you knew it for artemisinin and for that one, it wouldn't be a bad thing to know. I don't know how much detail. I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. Okay. So let's take a 10-minute break. If you guys can come back, well, we went a little longer. I meant to. If you guys can come back at 11. Make it 11:05 for me so I can get through everything, okay? Come back at 11:05, then we'll continue here. And if you have any questions, just write them down, okay? Let's put this on pause. All right. I said to be back around 11, right? I can't remember. You guys, did I say 11? I know it's 11:03 now. I think I gave you guys 10 minutes, right? Anybody out there? Okay. 11:05. Okay, thanks. All right, so let's get started. So I'll give you a couple examples, a couple exam questions that I might ask on what we just discussed. I might say something, which of the following drugs does not occur in nature, but is synthesized from a natural compound? So is it A, acetylsalicylic acid? Is it, or let's say, sorry, A, digoxin, B, Tamiflu, C, ephedrine. Another question would be, which of the following drugs exists in nature but was never used historically in herbal medicine? Is it A, ephedrine, B, Tamiflu, C, Taxol? So there's a couple examples. So we're going to go through and discuss a little bit of pharmacology, and I'm going to explain a little bit how things can work. Okay, this is a very superficial understanding of pharmacology, but herbs, they're not magical. I mean, they are magical in some ways, but the way they work is plants contain a bunch of chemicals, and when you eat those plants, those chemicals go into your body. Some of them are absorbed and interact with certain proteins and enzymes in the body to have that releases potentially neurotransmitters or opens up various transporters to raise blood pressure or blocks enzymes or stimulates enzymes, a whole bunch of different things like that. So to understand how herbs work on a molecular level, you can use pharmacology. So pharmacology is basically the study of how substances interact with living systems. So how biological active agents, meaning drugs potentially, interact with living systems, okay? Pharmacognosy is a discipline of that, where basically you're looking at natural substances that usually come from plants, but could also come from animals, microorganisms, seaweed, things like that. How these compounds interact with these living systems, okay? Toxicology, that just refers to basically how stuff, could be drugs, could be uh, toxins, how they interact and basically cause harm, okay? Now, there's two things that we're going to talk about that when you're reading about herbs, they'll discuss pharmacokinetics studies, and I'll explain what that means. So you've got pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics is basically what the body does to the drug when you ingest it or inject it. And pharmacodynamics is how the drug interacts with the body. So what enzymes are they inhibiting specifically, or transporters or proteins? Like, how does it, what's the mechanism of action of the drugs? And that's the pharmacodynamics. And the pharmacokinetics is how your body processes it. So to start with pharmacokinetics, most of the time we're going to be talking about how herbs, what happens when you basically take them orally. So if you drink a cup of herbal tea, or you take a pill that contains drugs, and you start measuring blood levels, what happens over time is there's a period where, the time sort of depends on the substance and everything else. These substances rise up in your blood, they peak, and then they start to come down over a period of time. And this might be let's say if you took a cup of herbal tea on an empty stomach and you started measuring the amount of one of the flavonoids in it, this is what would happen. So probably, it reaches its peak within, probably within minutes to an hour, I would imagine. And then it sort of remains elevated for a period of time, and then it starts to come down. So appreciate if you took all your pills first thing in the morning and didn't take any more for the rest of the day. The levels of those substances that you took in the pills, unless there's some binder that's used to sort of slow down the absorption, you're going to get a peak and then it's going to come down. If you took a cup of tea at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, your blood levels will remain elevated with that desired compound, or whatever the compound is, desired or undesired, for a much longer period than if you just take a whole bunch in a single dose, right? Just like if you sat down and drank, uh, 6 shots of alcohol first thing in the morning, you get a much higher peak than if you took only 1 shot. But if you took 1 shot, 6 times a day, it would remain at a certain level consistent throughout the day, rather than getting a really high peak and then sort of leveling out, okay? Now, so the pharmacokinetics is basically about how the drug affects, or how the body affects the drug, okay? And so when you take the pill, the drug, the herb, whatever it is, it goes into the mouth. Some of it can be absorbed in the mouth underneath the tongue. Some of it will go down the esophagus and be affected by the acid in the stomach. Some drugs can become, it can affect like for example, alkaloid drugs will become protonated potentially. Hydrogen gets added to it, and that could make it more water soluble, for example. And then it might get absorbed in the stomach, could travel to the intestines, be absorbed in the intestine, goes into the bloodstream, gets metabolized by the liver. The liver can basically undergo phase 1, phase 2 detox. There's a phase 3 detox as well. And so the liver could basically perform oxidation reduction reactions, adding protons or adding electrons or removing electrons from the drug, and then sticking something onto it that could make it more water soluble. It could be excreted in the bile, it could be excreted in the urine, in the feces. Some of it gets reabsorbed. So lots of different things that can happen to the drug in the body, okay? So that's pharmacokinetics. Pharmacodynamics refers to what is going on at a receptor or protein level. So most drugs, I would say, target specific proteins that the body makes and does something to them. So some of these proteins could be a receptor that if it binds to the receptor, it basically turns on or off some kind of biochemical process in the body. So if it binds to a serotonin receptor, it could affect mood, or it could regulate heat in the body, or it could affect digestive function, because serotonin receptors have lots of different ones that work by different mechanisms, okay? Or if it targeted an enzyme, it might block that enzyme, preventing that enzyme from functioning. So, for example, a lot of anti-inflammatory drugs will target the cyclooxygenase enzyme. So, and if it blocks cyclooxygenase 2 enzyme, it reduces the production of prostaglandins involved with inflammatory processes in the body. Okay, so if it blocks it, it's called an antagonist. Another example would be so an agonist will tend to turn receptors on, so it mimics the substance. So if something so serotonin binds to serotonin receptors. If a herb had a serotonin-like effect in the body, it might bind to that serotonin receptor and turn it on. Or an estrogen receptor. Estrogen can bind to it, but so could other things. Like, for example, bisphenol is a xenoestrogen. It's an environmental estrogen. It binds to estrogen receptors and turns it on really, really strong, okay? And then when it comes to estrogen, you could block that receptor by using a drug like tamoxifen. This is an anti-cancer drug that basically blocks these estrogen receptors. So there's no estrogenic effects in the body. And then the third thing that some of these things will do is, rather than turning it on fully or turning it off, it can modulate it. So phytoestrogens, this would be an example, would be the phytoestrogens in soy, the phytoestrogens in flax, in beer. Beer has hops, and hops has a flavonoid that has a phytoestrogenic effect. Most plant-based diets have a significant amount of phytoestrogens, and we know plant-based diets have been shown to lower the risk for breast cancer. So people get a little bit freaked out about soy thinking it causes cancer. It's a myth, okay? So environmental estrogens like bisphenol are very scary because they bind estrogen receptors even better than estrogen does. Tamoxifen blocks it, and then phytoestrogens modulate it. So to give you some pictures, I hope these things work, okay? Here's an estrogen receptor, and there's estrogen is bound to that receptor, okay? Here, we have genistein. This is an isoflavonoid in soy. It doesn't bind to the receptor as well as estrogen does, so it kind of like wiggles in there a little bit. Sometimes it turns it on, but sometimes it's just blocking it. So now estrogen can actually go into that receptor and have its effect. So what the isoflavonoid is doing is it's partially turning it on, partially blocking the receptor. So it sort of modulates the estrogenic effects in the body. Now, if you look at this xenoestrogen, this is bisphenol. This fits in perfectly into this estrogen receptor. So those little positive signs interact with the OH sign on the structure. So even though they structurally look very different, in three-dimensional space, the hydroxyl groups on these phenolic groups come in contact with those little positive charged amino acids that are there and tell that receptor to do something, okay? So again, estrogen binds in, it fits in there pretty good. And you can see the OH groups trying to interact with that little positively charged amino acid there. You see the isoflavonoid three-dimensionally, it doesn't quite fit quite as well, so it'll wiggle around a little bit, kind of turns it on, kind of blocks it from the estrogens. And then here's bisphenol, which is a really, really tight fit, and it doesn't like to leave there. And so we know that, for example, bisphenol, which is in some plastics, they're trying to remove it, it is greatly greatly increases the risk of breast cancer in women that have high amounts of this in their bodies. Maybe they're exposed to a lot of it through plastics or whatever else. What's kind of neat is that certain phytoestrogens like soy and flax, even though they bind to estrogen receptors, they actually have a modulating effect, and so they don't increase the risk of breast cancer, but in fact they either do nothing or they decrease the risk of breast cancer, probably because it helps to block endogenous estrogens, so estrogen that the body produces, and also xenoestrogens that are coming from like environmental waste. Okay, so we've got some strong agonists. So we got estrogen as an agonist. Xenoestrogens like bisphenol are strong agonists. Genistein from soy is a partial agonist. And then the drug tamoxifen, if you look at the structure of it, it doesn't contain those OH groups. So it binds in there. It has those benzene groups that kind of interact there, but it doesn't actually um, activate those little positive amino acids, so it blocks it. And so that means that the other estrogens, whether it's genistein or bisphenol, cannot interact with that. Okay? Does that make sense to you guys? So one of those slides apparently you guys don't have, but I don't know which one you're talking about. Just let me know. And if you it may not be necessary, some of these slides, it's a single slide with moving pictures in it, so you won't have every single one. That's why I included the slide after that. Now, something to be aware of is dose response curves in pharmacology. And so what this means is, and I'm sure you guys can appreciate it, having one glass of wine has an effect in the body. If you have 2 glasses of wine, you're absorbing more of that wine. Having 10 glasses of wine is a lot different than having 1 glass of wine. So the point is the more you take of a certain thing, the greater the effects. Now, depending on what the substance is, it usually starts to plateau. And so there might be a certain point where, let's say 100% response, in the case of, let's say, a sedative, or even wine for that, alcohol for that matter, as you increase the amount of wine that you have, there's a certain point where with wine, you just, maybe if it's like consciousness is your response in this case, there's a certain point where no matter what, alcohol as a sedative, eventually you reach the 100% response, which is basically the person goes unconscious and dies, okay? And that happens. Or a barbiturate, let's say a really strong sedative drug, if you take enough of it, or certain benzodiazepine drugs, like some of the date rape drugs, if you're given a high enough dose, you will go unconscious and be unaware of what's going on. And it could potentially, if you started combining these things, cause death. Or some of these sedatives could cause death if you take enough of it. Some of them will cause, like if you look at, for example, the purple one. Let's say if we're talking about opioids, for example, the purple drug there, the very first one, might represent the fentanyl, where only a few milligrams will cause death, and it's such a strong drug that the effect that you get is much greater than, let's say, the blue line, which represents opium, while maybe the orange line might represent something like a herb that just gently interacts with these receptors, like maybe California poppy or another thing that's a very, very gentle sedative. And so, or chamomile tea doesn't necessarily work with opioid receptors, but has a calming effect and a very gentle analgesic effect, let's say. So some things, very small amounts, could cause potentially death. So very powerful drugs would be represented with the purple one. Blue ones, they're powerful, but not as powerful as the blue one. And then orange things are very safe. Now, most herbs kind of fall in this orange line where they're not as powerful as the purple thing, but they're also not as dangerous. So you won't necessarily get the same side effects, but you also don't get the same effects to it. So if you were to have a cup of chamomile tea versus taking, if you had 10 cups of chamomile tea, you'd feel really relaxed, but nothing bad would happen. If you had an entire bottle of Valium, you probably would be unconscious. I don't know if you'd die, but you wouldn't do very well. Okay, or barbiturates, you could probably die from that. Okay, so the point is different things have a different response to it. In the case of the estrogen receptors, purple represents the xenoestrogens, the bisphenol. The blue might represent the estrogen. So it'll bind to all these receptors, but you need to have a higher amount, a higher, more like you might have to have 100 milligrams versus just 3 milligrams. And then the phytoestrogens show that no matter how much soy you take, you're never going to have the same effect as bisphenol or endogenous estrogen. Like you just can't expect to get that effect. And then tamoxifen just blocks those receptors no matter how much you take. Okay. Now things get kind of complicated in living systems because when you have, let's say, a test tube and you have an estrogen receptor in a test tube and nothing else in that. So you have a little, let's say, a cancer cell and you have an estrogen receptor in it. Um, if you add, let's say, the bisphenol or estrogen, you're going to stimulate the growth of the cancer cell. If you have like an estrogen-based cancer and there's nothing else in that test tube except for that cell, and you add a little bit of soy to it, it would potentially stimulate the growth of that cancer cell. And so this is why people have been like, if you have estrogen-based cancers, you should not take phytoestrogens. Because in a test tube, in isolation, it's been shown to have that negative effect, okay? But the rate at which it stimulates the cancer cell is a fraction of what it does if it's bisphenol or endogenous estrogen. But what happens is if you've got that cancer cell and you've added bisphenol to the test tube and you're stimulating that cancer growth, and then you add in soy, let's say, or another phytoestrogen, it slows the growth of that cancer down. So appreciate living systems are very complicated. And so what applies in a test tube doesn't necessarily apply to a living system where there's multiple things going on simultaneously. And that's one of the challenges with medicine is that there's a lot of variables. And so most conventional medicine is looking at things from a reductionistic model where you're trying to look at one enzyme and the effects of a single drug on that receptor. And that's one of the problems you get into when you're trying to figure out, let's say, nutrition and diet. You know, if you're trying to look at what is the healthy diet, what's the healthy thing in a diet? Is it vitamin C? Is it a beta carotene? Is it bioflavonoids? It's not one thing. There's a whole bunch of different things in that diet, and they're interacting with lots of different things in the body. Okay, so when you combine things in a system, there could be a cumulative effect where, you know, if you added xenoestrogens on top of estrogens, it amplifies the effects on those estrogen receptors. Or it could have an antagonistic effect where if you took tamoxifen and estrogen, it blocks that effect. Or it could balance the effects if you added phytoestrogen into it. Or there could be a synergistic effect as well. And I'll talk about that example later on, okay? So if you have substance A and it stimulates a receptor, and then you add substance B and it stimulates the exact same, binds to the exact same receptor with kind of similar affinity, then you're going to have like a cumulative effect. You know, it doesn't mean that 1 plus 1 equals 2. It might be that 1 plus 1 equals 1.5 because there's only so many receptors in the body. But the take-home message here is that, you know, these both have similar effects in the body and they'll have a cumulative effect if you add it. Now with herbs, an example of this with herbs, if you're combining herbs in a formula, if you have a herb that has, let's say, berberine in it, like golden seal, and if you add it to your formula with another herb that contains berberine, like Oregon grape, then you're kind of adding more of the same thing, even though it's from two different herbs. It's kind of like eating an orange and a nectarine. If you eat an orange and a nectarine, the benefits from the flavonoids and the vitamin C and the pectin is very similar between an orange and a nectarine. So you're gonna like a navel orange and a nectarine. So you're gonna kind of have a like a combined effect, you know, rather than having a new effect. It's just sort of the same thing doubled, you know, like eating twice as much. So that would be a cumulative effect. Okay, does that make sense? So An orange and a lemon might have a similar cumulative effect. It might be slightly different, it might be pretty similar. So herbs, like I said, if you took barberry and Oregon grape because you're trying to treat an infection, they both contain berberine. They might be slightly different, but they're going to be very similar. Now, that's a cumulative effect. Now, an antagonistic effect or a blocking effect is when you add something that's an agonist in the presence of an antagonist or a blocker is basically has this inhibitory effect and shuts down that enzyme, that receptor. So this is where if you had estrogen that's naturally produced in the body and you took a drug like tamoxifen at a high enough dose, that tamoxifen will bind to all those estrogen receptors and basically prevent the estrogen from binding. And so the overall effect on the body is that there's no estrogenic effect. And so that drives a woman into, let's say, chemically induced menopause. Okay? So there's an example. Now, another example in the herb world is that, for example, you could have serotonin receptors in the body, and you have them in the gastrointestinal tract, you have them in the brain. So, for example, serotonin receptors in the gut are involved with motility, and if you overstimulate them, you can get increased peristalsis that can lead to nausea and vomiting. Okay, and if you block those receptors, it can reduce nausea and vomiting. Okay, so substance C might be serotonin floating in the GI tract. Substance D might be ginger, and ginger contains gingerol, which acts as an antagonist for certain serotonin receptors in the body. There's lots of different serotonin ones, so it doesn't block the ones involved with happiness, but blocks the ones involved with actually anxiety and nausea. And so what ends up happening is it selectively decreases the effect. Maybe it's not quite to this extreme, but reduces nausea by inhibiting these serotonin receptors that are involved with nausea. Okay, so serotonin is an agonist for serotonin receptors, while ginger is an antagonist for those certain classes of them, not all of them, only certain ones. And so it helps to reduce nausea and vomiting. That's how you get that effect. So there's two examples. You've got ginger and tamoxifen both act as an antagonist for these receptors. Now, modulating effects is more related to what we talked about, the phytoestrogens, where substance C would be like estrogen in the body. Substance E is what happens if you take, let's say, flax or soy. And so if your body is producing estrogen and you take in soy or flax, then it kind of the overall effect, if you have high amounts of estrogen and you add in the soy, it'll modulate it. So it brings the overall effect lower than if the estrogen was taken alone, but higher than if the estrogen wasn't present and you only took the soy. So it kind of takes somewhere in between those two. So the first would be an example. Let's say if a woman during reproductive years had really bad periods and their estrogen levels were relatively elevated, and they're considered to have like sort of this hyperestrogenic state for whatever the reason may be. If you added in phytoestrogens, it could modulate. It wouldn't get rid of it. It wouldn't fully block. It would just maybe bring it down. So if the symptoms, let's say, of menstrual cramps were a 7 out of 10, maybe it would bring it down to a 5 out of 10. Okay, modulate a little bit. Maybe even better than that. Now, on the right-hand side, if that estrogen, instead of being really high, was really low, and this might be an example of a woman who's menopausal where she's getting hot flashes or she's at risk of getting osteoporosis, and you took a phytoestrogen like soy, it would bring up the overall estrogen levels above what would be normal for that menopausal woman. So in that case, it would kind of act as a gentle agonist. So in the first form, it kind of acts as a bit of a blocker, and on the second example, acts as sort of a stimulator because of the presence of how much estrogen is in the body. And this is why it modulates. If it's too high, it brings it down. If it's too low, it brings it up. And a lot of the herbs kind of have that modulating effect. Like it never really overstimulates those receptors. It kind of just sort of helps to balance it. So for a lot of the herbs that we use, the risk of overdosing or making a mistake is a lot more forgiving, which is kind of nice. In medicine, if you give the wrong thing, you can really get yourself into trouble. If you give someone a cup of chamomile tea and they didn't need it, they might just feel a little bit more calm, but you're not going to like knock them unconscious, right? So going back to the modulating effects with phytoestrogen, where you might use something like phytoestrogen is someone who has menstrual issues, like I mentioned, with menstrual cramps, or if they had uh, deficient estrogen levels and you wanted to reduce hot flashes. With a lot of people, these phytoestrogens are beneficial for preventing breast cancer. And this is what the research shows, is that either soy lowers the risk for breast cancer, or in some people it doesn't do anything. So worst case scenario, if you're taking soy, it does nothing or it lowers the risk for breast cancer. And same thing with flax. We know flax seems to have an inhibitory effect, especially in the presence of, if you've been exposed to bisphenols, more really, really toxic environmental estrogens. Let's say if you're drinking water out of plastic bottles that were loaded with bisphenol all the time. If you had a diet rich in soy, and so vegetarians and vegans were eating a lot of soy and eating a lot of nuts and seeds that were rich in phytoestrogens, it would have a protective effect. Also, some of these phytoestrogens will bind to the estrogen receptors in the bone and the brain to a greater degree and have a more of a stimulating effect on those receptors and more of a modulating or inhibitory effect on the ones in breast and ovarian tissue. So it's also been shown to be beneficial for osteoporosis while blocking more the risk of or reducing the risk of breast cancer. And some of them also have a beneficial, even though they're phytoestrogens, they can affect testosterone receptors to some degree and have a balancing effect there. So they can reduce the risk of enlarged prostates in men. So soy and flax are a couple examples, okay? If you look structurally at what's in flax seeds, the main active compound is called enterolactone, which, as an aside, it gets metabolized by your gut bacteria to produce this compound that gets absorbed and has the effect. Even though structurally genistein and enterolactone, they're different classes of phytochemicals, as I mentioned before, you can see three-dimensionally there's a few things in here that I think are really important for it interacting with that enzyme receptor, this estrogen receptor. They both have those two OH groups that seem to be required to have um, that interaction with the receptor to have some kind of agonist or partial agonist effect. Probably these guys do something too. I imagine this little oxygen group on here may interact with something as well. So both these guys have a phytoestrogenic effect. Even though structurally they're different, in three-dimensional space they can reach to those little receptors that have that effect. And so here's an example of a 2013 systematic review that was actually done at our college here, okay? Dr. Cooley still works there. He might teach you guys, I don't know. Anyways, in this group, they saw that the relative risk reduction for people consuming flax in their diet is it reduces the risk of breast cancer by about 18%. So it's not huge. Like that's not a major, like to put in perspective, most, let's say, blood pressure, cholesterol lowering drugs will lower your risk of having a heart attack between about 20 and 35%. So that kind of puts you in the category. So depending on the woman, you might have, it might help 1 in 50 women, might help 1 in 100 women. It's hard to say, but it also has a positive effect on mood. And then finally, mortality, just for heart disease and cancer, because these phytochemicals in flax, not only are they phytoestrogens, but they also have antioxidant, anti-inflammatory effects. Not to mention, flax also has omega-3s in there, fiber, good fats, fiber, antioxidants, and everything else. So flax is awesome. I eat it every single day, and I recommend all my patients to consume it on a daily basis with their breakfast. Adam's asking a question. I don't know quite where it went to. Is this like turmeric and black pepper? We'll talk about that afterwards. Black pepper may help with the absorption of turmeric, so it kind of works more maybe synergistically. If it works, it's kind of complicated because I'm not sure how well it works in humans. It works really well in rats. It may or may not work in as well in humans, but the research is conflicting on that, so I don't know what to say about that. I used to think it helped, now then I didn't. Now I'm kind of uncertain now. Uh, uh, so people ask, or so Sabrina's asking, why do we have the notion that soy is bad, and especially for men? I don't know. I think GMO soy is really bad. I think if you have a soy sensitivity, it's bad. But we know that soy for postmenopausal women lowers their risk of, can help with menopausal hot flashes, can help with weight loss, it can help prevent breast cancer. In both men and women, it lowers blood pressure, lowers cholesterol. Um, I know it doesn't appear to affect penis growth size, which, as men, that's all we care about. We don't care if we have a heart attack, but if it's going to affect our libido or the growth of, the size of our son's penis, that's, disturbing for us. I'm joking, but it's true. So the research doesn't seem to back it up for any of that. So I think it's a myth with it. I think the biggest concern that I have with soy is that if it's basically genetically modified soy where they're flooding the ground with Roundup and killing everything except for the soy plants. We know that Bayer, who was the original people who sold aspirin, and they still sell aspirin, they're one of the big drug companies. They bought Monsanto. Monsanto is a company that made Roundup. They bought them last year, and Monsanto is an evil company. Watch some documentaries. It will scare you how awful this company is. Probably like one of the worst companies on the planet, and they make the Roundup resistant soy for the world pretty much. And Monsanto is now losing lots and lots of lawsuits against them, showing how bad Roundup is and it causes cancer and everything else. So that could be one of the reasons, but I don't know why. If you look at the research, new research does not show any kind of negative effects of that. And if you can find something, please share it with me. I'm not. Uh, if you if I'm wrong, I'll admit it. Give me the evidence and we can discuss it. But to the best of my knowledge so far, I think soy is pretty good. Um, and I don't know if soy protein isolate is bad or if whole soy is good. I think they both have some benefits for sure. Uh, I take soy regularly. Um, it doesn't seem to. I've only had one patient who ate soy like 3 times a day, and he sort of was complaining of low libido, and I kind of took him off the soy and said, maybe back off and just do it once a day. Uh, it may have improved his libido, but that was a pretty extreme case. Certainly, for the average meat-eating man, he should be eating more soy, and or if you don't want to eat soy, then at least legumes. But the whole point is, men are all freaked out about soy, but then they'll drink beer like all the time, and beer has phytoestrogens that have more of an estrogenic effect on breast tissue and can have that stimulating effect. So I don't understand why they think that soy is for sissies, but you drink all the beer you want, even though we know that drinking beer is far worse on libido and causing breast tissue stimulation than soy is. So I like beer. Send me the paper, Laura. I'd love to see it. Um, and it may be talking about it. Who knows why? There's some other stuff here. Flax is good for BPH in men. Uh, breast cancer risk with women. Uh, people exposed to bisphenol A and having a protective effect with soy. So there's just some things. The last thing I want to mention is combining substances to have a synergistic effect. So what synergy means is you could take a few different substances and instead of getting 1 plus 1 equals 2, what you could get is 1 plus 1 equals 10. Or in some cases, 1 plus 0 equals 10. Okay? And so what that means is you have one substance that has an effect in the body and another substance that may not directly interact with the same receptor, but when combined, they have a synergistic effect. Okay? So I'll give you a couple examples of this. So remember when I talked about the ayahuasca? You guys probably think I'm kooky now because I was talking about that. So with the ayahuasca, which is that herbal brew in the Amazon, and sadly the Amazon's on fire. these days, so who knows how long this will be around for. It just breaks my heart. But anyways, um, so when you look at the ayahuasca, it's made of a few different plants in there, okay? So there's the ayahuasca plant itself, and there's another plant called chacruna. And so you need both these two plants brewed together in order to have the beneficial effect. Now, ayahuasca, as an aside, has been consumed by indigenous people in the Amazon for thousands of years. And I don't know how they were able to figure out that one herb alone doesn't do anything. But when you combine the two of them, suddenly it has this very powerful hallucinogenic effect. So when you look at, uh, oops, when you look at the chacruna plant contains dimethyltryptophan, and dimethyltryptophan is that compound that's naturally occurring in the body that normally gets released when you have a near-death experience or when you're sleeping, and it interacts with those serotonin receptors in your brain. Now, the problem is that when you ingest this orally, the dimethyltryptophan is inhibited by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase that resides in the gut. And the reason why this enzyme lives in your gut is you don't want to be hallucinating every time you eat dinner, because there's lots of compounds in your diet that could stimulate the nervous system. For example, there are things called tyramine, is a type of amino acid that's found in fermented foods that has sympathomimetic effect. It raises blood pressure and increases heart rate. And so if you're eating certain fermented foods, if you didn't have this enzyme, you could get what's called a hypertensive crisis. Basically your heart and your blood pressure will get jacked up too much. So normally dimethyltryptophan's basically inactivated by this. So when you have the one herb alone, there's no effect because it gets broken down. What's interesting is the ayahuasca plant has another phytochemical called harmaline, which has minimal or no effect on the serotonin receptors. But what it does do is it blocks this monoamine oxidase enzyme that normally inactivates the dimethyltryptophan. So the one herb gives you the potent hallucinogen. The second herb allows it to enter into the body. And so this is an example of synergy where one plant alone has essentially no effect or very little effect on the body, but when you combine them, there's an effect that occurs that's profound, very, very significant, okay? Now, another example of this is certain herbal antimicrobials, okay? And so berberine, I mentioned this already, this is a natural antibiotic, antifungal agent, and there's lots of different plants that have this particular compound in it. You can buy it as a supplement in isolation by itself, but it's found in whole farm, golden seal, barberry, Oregon grape. There's also a Chinese herb called coptis, and it's used for kind of a similar way that golden seal, barberry, and Oregon grape are used, basically as an antimicrobial, antifungal. And the way that it works, it inhibits an enzyme called sortase that cleaves certain proteins when they're being synthesized in the cell. And so the research on berberine shows it's not really that effective when it's given alone, or rather that you have to really give it at such a high dose. It's hard to achieve that in your body. It's hard to get blood levels that high. And berberine, it's relatively safe, but it's not like, I don't think you should be taking high dosages of this for long periods of time, that's for sure. And so the reason why it doesn't work by itself is berberine naturally diffuses through the cell membrane of these bugs. So this is my little picture of this octopus-like creature as I represent the little bacteria I drew up. And there's a transporter called a multi-drug resistant pump that normally actively pumps out some of these positively charged compounds, and some antibiotics are like this, out of the cell to prevent it from reaching a level that could be toxic or harmful. So multi-drug resistant pumps is one mechanism for bacteria to become antibiotic resistant. So berberine alone, you can put it like in a test tube with bacteria and start killing them off, but you have to get a really, really high dose. So it requires a very, very high dose in order to kill the microorganisms in the test tube, okay? And appreciate that when it comes to malaria or bacteria or even funguses, a lot of the drug resistance, not all of it, but a lot of it involves these little transporters that actively pump out drugs. They're also found in things like cancer cells. So the first round of chemo, you kill all the you kill 99.9% of the cancer. The second round, you kill 70%. The third round, it no longer is effective because a lot of the cancer cells have created these multi-drug resistant pumps, and that's allowing them to evade these chemotherapeutic agents. Now, there's a second compound in these herbs called a flavonolignin, and it's a bit of a mouthful. They refer to it as 5-MHC. And this 5-MHC compound lacks any kind of antibiotic or antifungal or antiviral property. So when you check it in the test tube, it doesn't kill anything. No matter how much you give, it does not cause any harm to these bugs. But what it does do is it blocks these multi-drug resistant transporters. And so as a result, the microorganism is unable to pump out the antibiotic or whatever the compound is, and in this case it's berberine. And so you basically reverse the antibiotic resistance. And I think this is one of the most exciting areas of research where we have a lot of really great antibiotics, but because of irresponsible use of antibiotics, especially in the farming, because basically with in the food production, they just prophylactically give chickens and bugs and pigs and cows tons and tons of antibiotics. So there's going to be tons of drug resistance occurring there to a bunch of animals that really don't need to take it, and eventually they're going to stop not working. And right now we're finding that no one's really creating a lot of new antibiotics. It's just sort of the same ones, just slightly different. So the concern for a major antibiotic crisis is real. And my opinion is rather than trying to create new antibiotics, why don't we start working on developing these drugs that help work synergistically with the existing one? Mother Nature's already done this, and maybe we can improve on that. The drug companies can modify this and find new ways to do this. For the time being, certainly I would, if someone had a really bad infection, I would say, yeah, take your antibiotics, and why not take some golden seal and barberry along with it if it's really bad. And so you can see here, when you combine the berberine with this 5-MHC compound, you need a lot less berberine to have the same therapeutic effects. Okay, so berberine alone, you need a lot of it. The 5-MHC alone does nothing. You combine the two of them, you have that synergistic effect. And I think that stuff's pretty cool. Okay. Perfect. I ended at 11:50, 11:51 now. Do you guys have some questions here? We got a couple questions. Do you see a difference between processed soy like tofu and fermented soy like tempeh? I've heard that tempeh is better for people because the fungus ferments it and metabolizes some of the compounds in it. So some people get bloating with soy, they don't get it with tempeh, but some people are fine with both. And certainly there are people around the world who live a long time and are really healthy, who eat tofu regularly, and they do just fine. Some people do better with tempeh. Some people have a food sensitivity, so they can't do soy at all. Some people have an allergy where it'll just kill them if they eat it. But soy is not, oops, sorry, may not be for everyone, but I think for some people it's good. And like I said, if there is research that shows that too much soy is bad for a group of people, I'd love to see it because I do eat soy, and our kids sometimes will have shakes that have a little soy protein powder in it. And if there's any concern on it, then let me know. Okay. Laura is saying there's an interesting documentary called Spirit Molecule, History of Research on DMT, if anyone wants to know about that. Sure. About soy, better to have organic, GMO free? Yes, I fully agree with that. Wendy is asking, would something like 5-MHC also work with antifungal resistance? It might. As an aside, that compound, there's a similar compound that we'll talk about later on in the phytochemical section called silymarin, which is found in milk thistle, and it appears to have, it targets multi-drug resistance in cancer cells. And so milk thistle may, even though it's an antioxidant, it may work synergistically with certain anti-cancer drugs to improve efficacy. And I don't know if they've gotten to the point where they're doing clinical trials with it and how far along the research is, but I would love to see more and more research showing, because we know that cancer drugs only work for a little while, and there may be ways to extend people's life even further to make those things, to reduce the side effects and increase the efficacy of them by combining it with some natural products. And I think, hundreds of years from now, maybe that's where we're going to go. So I don't think, in my opinion, natural therapies alone for cancer, you're not going to do as well as doing a combination of surgery, anti-cancer drugs, and natural things. I think some people probably don't need to take chemotherapy because you catch it early on, and I think some people uh, absolutely must be on it. There's a little bit of gray area with all these things. It's kind of complicated. Okay, so I hope you guys liked that lecture. Do you guys have any other questions or comments? Please leave them for me. I hope the sound and everything was up. Let me know how the sound was, how the video was, how you enjoyed the lecture, how you enjoyed the speed. I'll post some of these questions this week. I'm going to get this lecture posted as well in case you missed something. I'm going to try to get it posted by Thursday, if not sooner. Okay. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. We'll see you soon. Okay. Bye.